I've heard most of my life the saying that if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, but if you teach a man how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. And I teach people how to fish. I'm a sales trainer. And most people, when they hear the word sales, they get the little yuck feeling. I normally ask my audiences to hold up their hands if they had a mother that had a vision for them that they'd have a career as a salesperson when they grow up. And very few hands go up. I was in Asia last week, and they said, well, this is a sensitive subject, so maybe you shouldn't ask it. Maybe you should ask them how many of them had mothers that want to be doctors. So I did. So my first question there last week was, how many of you had mothers that wanted you to be doctors? And all their hands went up. But not too many hands go up for sales. Daniel Pink wrote a book a couple of years ago called To Sell is Human. And he makes the case that if any of us in our relationships with people are in a position where we would like to influence someone else to do something that we would like them to do, to influence them to do something that is difficult, but motivate them to do it anyway, that you're in sales. And so the idea is that from my study of the sales profession, I started as a sales trainer at Xerox in 1976. From my study, I've learned some things that we can all share as this earth gets more and more crowded. A number of people think we've already hit our optimum capacity, and it's going to get more and more crowded. And so the idea here is I want to share some ideas that can help us get along a little better. Daniel Pink's book, he put in a word cloud when he surveyed people about their idea of being sold and encountered by a salesperson. And the number one thing up here is pushy. So for years, I've been trying to reframe selling from being pushy, convincing, persuading, overcoming. In the 80s, I tried to reframe it to helping your customer solve a problem. But I like Daniel Pink's definition of influence. We're all in a position where we want to influence people. In 1979, I was at Xerox, and Xerox decided to tackle a very frustrating problem that was costing them billions of dollars. And that problem was that of their entire sales force, 20% of the people were bringing in 80% of the money. And they couldn't seem to move that needle. And so they finally concluded that these top 20% salespeople do it intuitively. And what they really do intuitively very well is to connect and build trust. But for the rest of them, they don't intuitively build trust and connect. And so Xerox was trying to figure out, is there something the top group is doing that we could model? Could we build a behavioral model over what the top group is doing, teach it to the bottom 80%, and make them all a little better? And so they hired this behavioral researcher named Neil Rackham, and in 1979, he discovered that each new batch of college graduates hired into Xerox, into sales, they go through 6 weeks of product training, get kicked out of the nest, and say, go sell for Xerox. And they will get better and better and better, but at 18 months, you could set your watch by it, they would go into a slump. Now, later on, I discovered that pretty much all salespeople go into a slump, and a lot of skilled professions go into a slump. Athletes hate being in slumps. Well, pretty much anybody hates being in a slump, but luckily, if you're in sales, there's a pretty simple solution. But you first have to understand the problem. And the problem was that over those 18 months, those salespeople became experts. It took them 18 months to know every combination and permutation of problem out there that their product set would allow them to address. And so on the first day of the 19th month, they'd hear 4 words from their customer about the problem. They go, oh, here's what you need. The irony was they were right. They could diagnose it in 4 seconds. They knew they had the perfect solution in their pocket. They got excited. They calculated the commission. Here's what you need. And that's when the slump started, because human beings don't like being told what they need to do. So in my workshops, I ask how many people are in a long-term, romantic, committed relationship like a marriage. Most hands go up. I say, all right, on the next break, I want you to call that person on your cell phone. Try 2 to 3 you need tos on him or her and see how they respond. Most people are wise enough to not even try it because they already know, right? They just do. And so this slump is fixable, but in order to get people to stop doing a behavior, it's really difficult for people to stop doing something unless you give them an alternative behavior to do instead, especially with kids, right? So in the case of salespeople, we say, when you're tempted to tell your customer what he needs to do, bite your tongue, catch yourself, and instead tell him a story. Because stories have been the way human beings have been communicating on this earth for 190,000 years. And for 190,000 years, there we go, the primary 2 purposes of story has been to pass on tribal knowledge and to motivate people to do difficult things that need to be done. The vast majority of that 190,000 years, there was no written language. But those stories were important. If Grandpa died eating those red berries, then we want to pass that story down to everybody else so nobody else eats those red berries and dies. But story is in our DNA to the point that when a human being anticipates a story, and we all get our kids hooked on it with Once Upon a Time, unconsciously, after 190,000 years, when we anticipate a story, we go, oh, a story. I can just relax. I don't have to make a decision. I don't have to do anything. So at the same time, though, there's another place in our mind that says, but this might be important information, so I better pay attention and listen carefully. And so if you think about it, could you ask for a better state of mind if you're in sales, certainly for your sales message. But we find that stories can be used by all human beings who want to influence other human beings to do difficult things that need to be done. So initially, I was going to do just talking about story as a replacement for the behavior of telling people what they need to do. And then a few days ago, Adam said, well, when you're at the Chamber of Commerce, you also talked about story tending. And I'd like you to talk about story tending too. Well, in the sales world, the primary purpose of telling a story to your buyer is to get the buyer to open up and tell you his or her story. And in that tending of that story is where the real connection and trust are built. Same thing is true with everybody, though. The night 2 assignment we give in our workshops, homework assignment, is to go home or get on the phone tonight and tend the story of someone you love. And they come back the next morning with stories about tending their kids. One guy had 4 daughters, and he tended his youngest daughter, 11-year-old, with the question, what's it like to be the youngest child in his family? And people come back reconnected with their teenagers. And I did a workshop, a story workshop this past summer for the first time with a room full of CEOs instead of salespeople. And CEOs have something called authority that salespeople don't. Great salespeople have to influence without authority. They have no authority over their customer. When people are CEOs, they have lots of authority, and most people will do whatever they tell them to do because they're the boss. But I asked the CEOs, I said, what's the one group of people that even you with your CEO power have a hard time managing? And the answer eventually became teenagers. Teenagers are the hardest group of human beings in the world to influence. And most of them have teenagers. And so we actually talked about What's the one thing you just absolutely can't stand the thought of your teenagers doing? And that's texting while they're driving. All parents of teenagers worry about that. And most parents, they take out that authority card and say, if I ever find out that you're doing that, you're not going to see that car again until you're 25 years old. They take out the authority card. And so one of the exercises we practiced is to have these guys construct a story around a real event. They read in the paper some unfortunate thing that happened to another teenager texting while driving, and bring it up at breakfast. Tell your teenager about that story you just read and how it just sunk your heart to think about the parents of that poor teenager, and turn to your child with love and say, please don't do this. It's too dangerous. Put your phone in the glove compartment and ignore it while you drive. And they tried it, and they were amazed at how much better their teenagers responded to them. And so the whole idea of getting people more connected, we all have instances where we want to look at somebody and say, you need to do that. You need to do this. And the problem with most advice is that it's unsolicited. How many of you enjoy unsolicited advice, right? So if you want to give somebody advice, which is a very human nature thing to do, I guess, is construct a story to influence them to decide to do what you were originally going to just tell them to do. It's huge. Back to story tending for a minute. The word tending last week in Asia grew a kind of a deer in the headlights look when we threw out the word tending. And I have a representative there who's Chinese, and she got up and she said, think of tending a fire or tending your garden. You tend your garden with love, you tend a fire with love, and you want to tend the other person's story with love. And we've been using the Chinese symbol for listening in our workshops because it really does kind of encompass connective listening. The final thought I'll give you, though, is that sometimes you're in authority and sometimes you don't have time to think up a story to influence the other person, and you end up just choosing to use your authority. A couple of alternative ways of saying you need to that fly a lot better would be, instead of you need to, I would love it if you would. I need you to. I'm your parent. I need you to. Would you try something for me? Would you do this for me? There's a number of ways you can be didactic without telling people what they need to do. And with our population over 7 billion and climbing rapidly, I thought that this would be an idea worth sharing to help us all get along a little better. Thank you.